Okay, so I'm just going to quickly introduce myself while we wait for more people to join. My name is Denisha. I am the current webinar director for Científico Latino. I'm a fifth-year neuroscience grad student at the University of Rochester, and the webinar coordinator is going to also introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Roberto Rodriguez. I am a fourth-year PhD student studying neuroscience at the Rockefeller University, and I am this year's webinar coordinator for Científico Latino, and I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. So today's webinar is going to be about talking about the graduate student admissions process, and we're going to be able to hear from the faculty. We have lovely faculty joining us from different programs, and I'm going to introduce them in a second. Yeah. So first up, we have Dr. Sweta Agrawal, and Dr. Sweta Agrawal joined the School of Neuroscience at Virginia Tech as an assistant professor in 2023. She's a lifelong lover of weird and mysterious biological phenomenon. And so when she learned about the brain, it was love at first sight. I feel the same. Now her lab studies the neural circuits underlying proprioception and motor control using the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster as a model system. So welcome, Dr. Sweta.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Kent Griffith. Dr. Griffith is an assistant professor of chemistry and affiliate professor of nanoengineering at the University of California, San Diego. His areas of interest include multivariable synthesis and advanced characterization, solid state NMR spectroscopy, X-ray spectroscopy, X-ray and neutron diffraction of battery materials and other functional inorganic compounds. Welcome, Dr. Griffith.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Dr. Matthias Garten. Dr. Garten is an assistant professor in the Department of Immunology and Microbiology and the Department of Bioengineering. He is a membrane biophysicist who is driven by the question of how the malaria parasite interfaces with its host red blood cell and how we can use the unique mechanisms of the parasite to treat malaria and to re-engineer cells for biomedical applications. Welcome, Dr. Garten.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have lots of questions prepared for you guys, but if at any point you guys can feel free to use the Q&A to drop a question or use the chat, and then we can stop and further discuss. And then I will also give each professor an opportunity to further talk about themselves and their lab and a little bit about their program. Whoever would like to start first.
Sure, I can go ahead and get started. So my name is Sweta, and I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech in the School of Neuroscience. And I have helped so far with admissions for one cycle for grad school for two different programs. And so I've helped out with an interdisciplinary program, a PhD in molecular and cellular biology, which is a program that has a bunch of different labs and a bunch of different departments that students can work with. And then also just a couple years ago, my department started its own graduate program in neuroscience. And so that one, I mean, like actually we have faculty throughout the campus that work in neuroscience that are affiliated with that program. And so you can work in labs outside of like the department proper. But it's a bit more neuroscience focused. And so they each have their own quirks as far as how admissions work. And it's interesting for me to now be on this side of things, helping out with admissions. And so, yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about either one and tell you a bit more. And then my lab, we are mostly a neuroscience lab, although we do some work on biomechanics and some evolutionary biology as well. And we're broadly interested in how animals move through the world, mostly using Drosophila, but we've started some work with mosquitoes as well with Aedes aegypti. And then we're expanding into doing some comparative work across insects at large. So,
yeah. Okay, I can go next.
So yeah, everything that was said by Denisha, thank you for the introduction. So I'm here since 2.5 years. I have gone through now three rounds of grad admission, so they let me participate when I was not here yet even. I review admissions in two programs, the microbiology immunology program, which is actually part of a larger program, the biosciences program, and bioengineering program. And yep, there are some commonalities and differences that I'd be happy to talk about. I think they're covered by all the questions. Yeah, I think the summary by Anisha was pretty good. So I'm very fascinated by compartmentalization actually. So like it's more of a philosophical fascination how compartments contain life and they have to negotiate their being alive with the environment. And then parasites, they negotiate their life with another living thing, and they are more on the side of taking out rather than giving back. But I feel like there's actually a spectrum between parasitism and commensalism. So I want to try to walk that from see if we can make parasites maybe into commensals because they have already a good niche that they live in their host, and maybe one can exploit that. And yeah, I'm generally fascinated also by non-model organisms because I feel they have very interesting biology and mechanisms or ways they installed mechanisms that we want to know more about. So
Thank you, Dr. Garten.
thank you.
Dr.
Yeah.
Griffin?
And for my side, so the timeline actually very similar to Dr. Garten. So I started, I've been on three admission cycles at least, and also started kind of before I arrived, which was great to get to know the incoming group of students. So I've been on the admissions committee every year for our both our chemistry PhD program here at UCSD and also the material science master's and PhD program. So I've seen some of the physical sciences side and the engineering side. My lab is about entering our kind of second full year, but we've been around for close to 2 years, I guess, so maybe more towards the third year. And we're interested in materials chemistry broadly, inorganic materials. And so this always is kind of an interdisciplinary, a little bit of solid state physics, a little bit of inorganic chemistry, a little bit of engineering to make batteries. And we try to bring as much of that together as we can. So we do synthesis, we make materials, and we do a lot of characterization. So a lot of, as you saw in the bio, a lot of spectroscopy, a lot of diffraction and kind of characterization tools. Because when you make materials, you really need to understand their atomic structure. And so that's what we focus on in my lab.
Thank you guys so much for that introduction. I'm gonna turn it over to Roberto now, who's gonna get into some questions.
Awesome. So let's get to it. So many of these questions are going to have multiple parts, as you'll see. But yeah, like please feel free to like comment as much as you can on these questions. So to get started with the first question, what are the steps for reviewing applications? And what does the review process look like at your respective institutions? Since I know it's so variable across institutions and of course across departments as well.
You want to call out people, or should we just negotiate by looking at each other?
So I guess you guys can decide among yourselves who wants to take the question. Of course, like if anyone else has any other comments, like please feel free to expand as much as possible. So
Okay,
who wants
so
to take this one? Okay, sounds good.
I guess it can start since I already talked. So at the you apply centrally. So I have to preface, I didn't go through that system. I did my PhD outside of the US, so that's my view from my side. So, but maybe that's also what you're asking for. So, we get a bunch of applications. So in one program, the BIE program, we get 800, and the other program we get about 600. The aim is to get from the 800 in BioE to about 40 that we want to admit. And for MNI, we go from the 600 to 4. So that's something to note. If you can kind of figure out what the odds are for each program that you apply for, that can help a little, because you can imagine that going from 600 to 4, there's more of an element of chance than going from 800 to 40. And yeah, so then those are kind of chopped up to feed teams of 2. I get, for each program, I get about maybe 40, 50 applications to read. And then you do a pre-selection. So you have a first committee meeting where you try to figure out who you want to interview. So for the BioE program, we go from the 800 to 100. And for the M&I program, we go from the 600 to, I want to say 15-ish. So that's kind of the big cut. And then you have the chance to convince the committee yourself in person. For M&I really in person now, and for BioE we still did Zoom, unless my memory is not good right now. It's all pandemically rewired there, but I think that's essentially, yeah, you can then talk to the people, and then you have a second committee meeting where we then decide who we make an offer and who not. That's
Yeah.
all.
For the programs that I've helped review, both of them are actually quite similar to one another. We don't get nearly as many applications, I think in part because we're just a smaller school and both programs are quite a bit newer. And we, as a result, like we make sure that each application gets viewed by at least 3 different faculty members or people from, we actually have 2 graduate students that are part of the admissions committee for the School of Neuroscience one as well. So they help with reviewing the applications. So each one gets at least 3 eyes on it, just because different people pick up on different things. The neuroscience is such a broad field and people are coming from so many different backgrounds. And we end up ranking the students and kind of have a score sheet that we put together. And then through that, we kind of rank them. And they're always like the very obvious ones that like we will be interviewing and like the obvious no's. And then we have a pretty lengthy Zoom discussion for the people that are in the middle. And the amount of students that we end up inviting to interview is just kind of dictated by the number that we want to admit that year. And then also, especially for School of Neuroscience, we're a new department and a new program. And so we just don't have the funds to bring in like as many people, right? And it kind of varies from year to year how much we will have. And so that's really the limiting step as far as how many people we can bring in for an in-person interview. And as a result, I think one thing that we do that at least I hadn't seen when I was interviewing for PhD programs a while ago, so maybe things have changed. And I don't think my old University of Washington used to do this either. But before we actually invite people for the full interview, we do kind of like a Zoom pre-screener where we chat with each of the prospective applicants for something like 10 to 15 minutes. It's pretty short, and ask them a series of questions. And that's because, we're a smaller program, a smaller university. We want to use our money smartly. And so we want to try and like actually have people interviewed that are truly interested in our program, and aren't just viewing it as like perhaps a safety or just like something that they applied to on a lark. Like we want to make sure that they're actually motivated to come here. And it's been actually those Zoom interviews have been pretty informative on that front. And so, if you are faced with something like that, to anyone in the audience that might be an applicant, I definitely recommend that, do the homework as far as like thinking about the faculty members that you would want to work with and kind of name drop them. Just make it clear that you're interested in the program, and can speak to that, right? And then from after those Zoom interviews, again, we kind of invite a final group for the full interview. We have at least one in-person weekend that we do every cycle. And then we sometimes do, well, we definitely always have a Zoom interview like a full day kind of Zoom interview where you meet a bunch of different faculty members and like do the full interview for any international applicants, and then anyone that can't make the in-person. And so that's kind of convenient that now everyone's familiarity with Zoom has made it so that we can interview more applicants and also like be a bit more inclusive of people coming from other countries that it might be hard to have them travel to us otherwise.
Yep, and from my side, so there are some differences. I think also just between fields, and so in chemistry and in engineering of like material science and engineering, I think it's pretty uncommon to have actually interviews as part of the process. So we do admissions directly from the applications that are submitted. And then the admitted students are invited to come to campus, but not as an interview. I mean, these are after admissions have already taken place. And so, but from my colleagues here, I've noticed that the biochemistry field does implement actual interviews during those visits. And so basically, at least my read of it is that in broad strokes, I mean, more biologically oriented fields are tending to do interviews more commonly across programs, and other physical sciences and engineering programs maybe do less of that. But so that, I mean, I think that is a big difference, right? Because from my side, like from the inorganic chemistry side and the materials side, your paper package that you submit is the entire application, and you might never speak to anyone between sending that in and finding out whether you got admitted or not. So that's a bit, I think, scary from both sides in some sense. And so things are probably evolving. Like we're actually moving now to at least trying to implement these brief Zoom interview discussions so that we can get to know each other better, because it is a big commitment. Again, actually, just from both sides, programs have a limited number of spots of students to admit. And so, it's something on the order of a 5-year commitment from the students, but it's also a 5-year commitment from the faculty that are supervising those students. And so if you think about both sides of it a little bit, I mean, everyone wants to have a good working relationship there. And so the process is really important from both sides. For the review process, in my program, and where we're very large, so our chemistry department handles something like 700 PhD applications a year, and admits maybe 50 or 60, or brings in a class of 50 or 60, so admissions are higher than that. And with that scale, it's absolutely necessary to divide those applications into subcategories, maybe more than once, right? So you can't have one committee reviewing 700 applications. So there will be categories where you'll have students applying to different tracks, so inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, physical chemistry, analytical chemistry, environmental chemistry, all these kind of things. And that's as simple as basically like selecting the box on the application. But again, I mean, I think that's something for you to think about, especially if you're interdisciplinary, which more and more people are these days. If what you want to do doesn't fall squarely into one of these categories, you might need to think about the fact that selecting that box is going to determine who's going to review your application, or it might, right, for a given institution. So, if you're doing something in between, like if you're in kind of this biophysics area, but there's not a specific, track or program for that, do you want to be reviewed by more biocide, or do you want to be reviewed more by the physical chemists? And they're going to do their best to evaluate you in the context of the program, but just realistically, I mean, there are going to be tendencies there, right, of how much they understand and how much they grasp, and what makes more sense for you to be reviewed by. So that's a major consideration. And then to echo the point from Dr. Agrawal, I think that we're even in a really big program like this, I mean, we are also pretty laser focused on making sure that you actually want to come here, and that there are faculty that you would work with if you came here. So we have maybe over 50 faculty in the department, but you know, everyone is specialized. And so if your application doesn't list anyone that you want to work with, and it doesn't, or it listed in a way that doesn't seem like you really put an effort into looking into these people, then that's one of, I would say, especially from the perspective of someone who's admitting you directly from the application, right, from the paper application, that's our only opportunity to know whether you've really looked into this program in detail. Because one of the riskiest situations would be to admit someone who can't find a good mentor, right, at your program. So for everyone's sake, we want to make sure that there are going to be one or ideally multiple PIs that would be a really good fit and that are taking students that you'd be able to match with when you come. And so that's really critical, I think, on top of everything else. Probably for every program that you would apply to, is you can't send out blanket applications where you're not specifying who and why you want to work with specific people. Because when you get there for a PhD in particular, I mean, sure, you're in a department, but I don't know, 95% of your time is the lab that you're in more specifically. So it needs to be individualized.
And I realized I forgot to mention two things. One, at least for us, and I know that this is the case often at other universities as well, sometimes there are programs that communicate a lot with one another. And so, for example, when reviewing the MCB application, sometimes we'll see someone who would be better suited for the infectious diseases program, which is another one of these umbrella programs. And so we actually have the ability to kind of like bump the application over and have them be reviewed by someone else. And so just know that that's a possibility of something that might happen as well. And yeah, and so, but again, like put some thought into, a lot of these universities have a lot of different programs and you might be able to apply with lots of them. And so it might either becomes a game of like, who are the faculty that are included in each program, or like Dr. Garten said, like maybe a numbers game as to which ones might be more competitive, or the particular things that they might be looking for in each program. And often you can write to the programs and see if you get a response, like, you know, kind of suggest that you would apply for either one of these. Sometimes, like I think at Virginia Tech, you can apply for multiple programs at once, but other universities you can't. And then finally, I also wanted to mention that our application does have a fee waiver, but we also have it has an application fee, but you also can request a fee waiver. And so I'll put a link into the chat that leads you to like that form to request that. And again, many programs that still have fees often have the ability to request a fee waiver, and they're often pretty willing to give those away. So if you need one, definitely look into that.
I also have something to add that came to mind when Dr. Griffith or Ken was talking. So to guide kind of who's going to review you, there is in the application form for us, you have to write in the PIs or the groups you're interested in, and that's highly likely that one of those people or two of those people are going to review you. So that's super important. And also, if you're really only interested in the one lab in the program, you're probably not going to make it in. You have to have a range of labs that you can rationally rationalize a fit to, so that in case that goes wrong with that one lab, we have you covered. So we want to be everyone successful, and that's one way of making sure of that. And one minor, or actually major point maybe, is also when you choose a program, if you can figure out where the money is coming from. So because if it's coming from NIH, you basically, well, you have a, for the M&I program, you have a 1 in 800 chance to get in. So because our money has to go to citizens or permanent residents. So that's something to keep in mind. BioE that's not the case, so we can take international applicants, and you can maybe write to people before and figure that out if it's not obvious.
Thank you so much. So now let's move on to the next question. So this is a big question, but It's on the theme of holistic approaches to admission. So, first part is, how does the selection committee enforce a holistic approach to the application reviewing process? For example, blinding GPA. What advice you have for students who have low grades? That's a question as a scientific Latino mentor I used to get a lot. And also, I know a lot of programs are moving away from standardized testing like GRE, but in the cases of programs that still require this kind of testing, how much emphasis do you place on standardized test scores versus actual research experience? So who wants to take this one?
Yeah, I know for us, the main reasons why we pay attention to GPA and certain standardized test scores, mostly the TOEFL, is that our university has certain minimums that the grad student has to have had from undergrad in order to be able to TA for classes. And there are some ways around it, but it just makes it a little bit harder to get those TA shifts if you had an especially low GPA in your undergrad. Until, like, of course, you've gotten your grades as a graduate student. That doesn't mean that we can't admit students that have I mean, and again, that cutoff is extremely low. So but if you do have low grades, I mean, I think the main advice that I have for making up for that is through things like research experience, or also those letters. You can have one of your letter writers. I think one thing, like, don't be afraid to speak to the people writing you letters and maybe give them suggestions for things that they could include in those letters, so that way they can be more targeted. Often faculty actually appreciate that if they have some sort of like direction for what would be most useful in a letter for someone, if you know them kind of well enough. And so, you can mention that you had these low grades. So could you emphasize like how, despite those low grades, I still have quite a bit of like content knowledge that I've exhibited while working in your lab, or ways that I've kind of like made up for that. And so I think that can go quite a long way to kind of, you can write about it in your statement to some degree as well, and turn it into like something that you overcame, especially if your grades got better later on. But then also having like the people with faculty with whom you've done research or other things speak to like skills that you have that like that go beyond those grades.
I can jump in next. So I have thought about this kind of thing a lot, actually. And so first of all, I'm gonna like push back a little bit from the review side and say, discussing a holistic approach to application reviewing and then saying blinding GPA and removing GRE scores are kind of counter to one another. So, that wouldn't be considered, in my opinion, a holistic way to review an application. I think it stems from this idea that, if you include standardized test scores or GPA, that there are, these automatic drastic cuts made to the applications just based on that single number alone. And, people have more to their story than that. But from what I've seen, that's really not the case. And so when you remove information that might give students an opportunity to show what they've done or to demonstrate something, you're kind of leaving the committee with less to go on. And just as an example, I'm also well aware of the discussions and the literature around, for example, like biases in test scores, across demographics. And again, a point to that is, so yes, if you go on test scores alone and you use nothing else, that would introduce a serious bias into the review. But a counterpoint to that is that if those biases across test scores are understood, then a student who maybe didn't have as much research experience or even had a lower GPA because, say, they were working through their time in their studies, or they were at an institution that didn't offer them as many opportunities, for example, was able to demonstrate through, a higher test score that actually, although they haven't had the opportunities yet, they'd be a great candidate for a PhD program. That allows them to stand out in a way that is not available otherwise, right? Because I think the really important thing is to think about, when you remove parts of the review process, is what you're left with less biased? And so if you remove grades, if you remove test scores, then you're left with letters of recommendation, which are very biased. You're left, I mean, also in terms of just opportunities, right? If students are working or other things and don't have the opportunity to make those relationships as deeply, then, but there's real biases in recommendation letters for many reasons. And you're left with what, the institution where the student went. That's a bias that none of us want to use as an overweighted factor in this, right? But if you take away everything else, then that's what's left. And so if there were some perfectly unbiased thing to review students on, that would be fantastic. But given that that's not real, then we have to think about really holistic review, right? And so yeah, I say this as a way to think about that I from what I've seen on various committees that I've been on across different departments and different programs, faculty don't overweight GPA. I mean, they don't look at this and say, oh, this student has a lower GPA, we're not going to admit them, because everyone who's been doing this for any time at all knows that GPA is not a linear correlation with success in grad school. Because grad school isn't coming in and taking tests and doing well on them. So I've never met a professor who thinks that GPA should be the main criterion for whether a student is going to do well in the program. And for that reason, I think that we need to include, in some sense, as much information as possible so that we can, because I think at the end of the day, truly, these committees that are doing admissions want to admit the best students who are going to be the most successful with the program that they are admitting people into. Like, no one has any ulterior motive than that, right? It's best for both parties if that's the situation. So that's my kind of long response to some of these ideas. I do truly understand where they're coming from, but I also think that we kind of put ourselves in harm's way by removing one understood bias for some other type of less understood bias. I don't think we want students to be admitted purely on rec letters and the institutions they went to. So we need to see as much of a picture as we can. And then I'll also, yeah, just in practical terms, we do the same thing with like TOEFL scores and stuff, where the university requires a minimum score so that students can teach, because that's a requirement for our program. And so there are speaking, like TOEFL scores, there's some minimum speaking TOEFL score required to be admitted for that. And again, there are ways to get around it for international students that basically, at least at our place, they have to be directly in agreement with the PI that you're going to work with, who essentially agrees that they will help you get your language scores up to the level they need to be so that you can teach before you graduate. So if you're not there in the first year, then maybe you can get there in your second or third year, and then that's still doable from our side. But yeah, otherwise, there aren't cutoffs, there aren't other things implemented. I mean, I think the holistic part, like I said, is as important to the committee as it is to the student. Ultimately, we want the best people who will be the most successful in our program, and nobody thinks that means GPA and GRE alone.
Awesome.
Good.
Dr. Garden, yep.
Thanks. So I would say the GPA is something we glance over if it's not. I mean, for some programs like the bioengineering program, you would want to have good grades in quantitative classes, physics or math. Otherwise, that can be very difficult to advocate for your application. Otherwise, yeah, we're looking to have a holistic approach. I think we're looking for trajectory. So if you start in a less affluent environment, then and you can clearly show that you have your heart set on research, and you are motivated for the things that you did kind of actually outside of what you're supposed to do, then this is very highly valued. So we had people coming in with a 3-ish GPA, but it was clear from the letters they were not interested in being in the class. They were interested in being in the lab. And yeah, so it can be very helpful to have a long relationship to one lab already. I just see this question for the summer research. rather than having multiple short ones, because those letters will be more profound and can speak to your motivation and, you know, to your also persistence and doing one research project, which is what you're going to do as a PhD student. And if you can show that instead of having been good in classes, that is better, at least from my perspective, and I think also from large part of the community that I'm working with. Standardized test scores, we don't know, we don't do that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I guess
Awesome.
following up on that about the long-term research experience, I mean, I know for me, like I look to make sure that they've at least like spent like full-time, some amount of full-time in the lab, like maybe that would be the summer research program, but they've had the experience of doing like the 40 hours a week in a lab and like that's what their time is spent around. I think like we, especially at Virginia Tech, where there's a lot more demand for students wanting research experience than we can possibly ever satisfy. We understand that people won't necessarily have like that long-term experience of like a lot of research experience. So but we do look that it adds up to something like 2-ish years worth, and are somewhat flexible in that depending on how maturely they can speak about what research experience they have had and what their interests are in like the statement or that. But I agree with Matthias that like the long-term research experience definitely is more attractive because it really speaks to someone having hopefully, like, you know, in science, you can definitely expect things to not work out and to have to do a lot of troubleshooting. And so if you've been in a lab long enough, you are more likely to have encountered things just not working out and having to kind of persevere beyond that versus students that are just in the lab for like a summer for 10 weeks here and there, right? Uh, it's not a make it or break it thing, but you definitely would maybe be like you'd want to be able to then emphasize that you can speak maturely about the science that you have done.
Thank you all for your insights. So third question, so what stands out to you when reading a personal slash research statement, and what should applicants focus on and emphasize in both essays? So I know we have a lot more questions to go through. So in the interest of time, if only one of you can take this question, and if another one of you really needs to add something in, like please do. But yeah, we really want to get through as many questions as possible. So who wants to take this one?
Okay, I can try to be brief. So the research statement, they are of very varying quality. I and you have to know that, well, you know, if you have this number of applications, you're probably not going to read that in great detail as a reviewer, I have to admit. So it's, for me, I'm looking for less of a personal story than rather of a, like, why do you wanna do research? So if you can make that clear, that's very helpful to advocate for your application. And also, if you talk about your fit to the program, so this Professor ABC, those I'm going because of reason A, B, C, D, and that's what I'm looking for. And it's very hard to, I know that one is supposed to write about the past research experience, but if it's too detailed, there's just no way of understanding that in the time that we have to review the application. So if you stay big picture and you write it so that your favorite relative could probably understand it, that's very helpful to actually get the content.
Yeah, I agree with that. That it just, for me, a lot of what I'm looking for, especially with the research statement, is can you talk about in a way that it makes sense to, especially if I'm not familiar with the particular research that you're doing, which is a very high likelihood of being the case. So do I still understand it? And, you know, you want to emphasize like, what's the problem? Why is that problem important? How did you address the problem and why?
Good. A
Cool.
personal statement, I guess you're talking about like what was previously the diversity statement, or what we call now the enhancement of research or learning experiences. That's what you're talking about there?
Yeah, yeah. So like, what aspects of like a student's like story or like research experience like they should like emphasize and like just
So okay, so well, there I guess it's good to get to know kind of where they are coming from without maybe going. I mean, yeah, you don't have to go too much into detail, but then also how would you use that experience to improve the experience of others that and bring them into into science, into research. So that's what I think is good to see.
awesome. So our next question is, can you explain how you review an applicant's research experience? And I think you guys have touched a little bit of base on this, but if you want to expand a little bit and what specific elements are you looking for? If an applicant has prior research related to the field that they are currently applying to, should they still include that research experience? And do you have advice for students transitioning to tangentially related fields? Like, for example, someone who has a background in neuroscience transitioning into chemistry. I don't know if Dr. Griffith wants to take this one.
Sure. Yeah, so we kind of addressed this in one of the questions, but we have a rubric for our program at least that we use, so that because we have so many different faculty, as I said, we have hundreds of applications being reviewed by tens of faculty. So we have a rubric to try and make things a little bit more consistent. And in terms of applicants' research experience, we try to account for essentially the opportunities that would have been available, right? So if someone's coming from a PUI or a non-doctorate granting institution, then we don't expect them to have been in the same type of research lab during the academic year that they would have had opportunities for, say, if they were at a big, state public research institution or other major research institution. So, we look for basically that the student has looked for opportunities that are consistent with their experiences. So if you are at one of those institutions that doesn't have doctoral programs, then, did you look for REUs? Did you look for research intensive internships, things like that? And those would be weighted equally, is my point essentially. If possible, having some consistency within yeah, so I'm going to say there's some subtlety in between like these middle two questions. If possible, showing some consistency through your research, like staying in one lab, I would say generally for 2 to 3 years is better than having a different lab every 6 months. Those are kind of two extremes of a spectrum that if you have switched because at some point you were doing research and you realized, halfway through your time that wasn't what your interests were and what you wanted to do, and so you made a switch, and you can write just briefly about that in your statement that, when I was a freshman or sophomore, I joined this lab, and no one expects you to know exactly what field you want to go into at that stage. And then you say, and then I realized that my passion was actually in biochemistry, and so I switched to a biochemistry lab, and now I've been doing that for a year or something. I think that's great. I think that's a great story. It'll be very straightforward. But if you've been in like if you're switching around a lot, I think it'll raise questions, because ultimately, again, a PhD program is going to be one lab for 5+ years, and it's important that you are able to kind of follow through with things. Research has lots of ups and downs, right? This is more about the PhD itself, but that's what the applications are trying to evaluate you for, right? Is, are you going to be able to kind of stick with it through the good times and the bad, and keep pushing, on a project and on the research that you're doing and on the science. And so having a narrative that you switched labs because you needed to find what was right for you is great. But just showing that you were in 5 different labs and not explaining anything why about that is going to do the opposite maybe of what some students in my experience think. They might think, oh, people are going to be really impressed that I've been in 5 different labs. But my opinion is that the committee will really wonder why you switched labs so much unless you have a narrative to explain it. So but the whole transition question, you know, moving to different fields, that I don't think is a problem for anybody. It's not a, you know, we've all done that most likely at some point, and we all understand that. So switching to something that's a better fit with you, is totally, you know, reasonable and rational, and you can write that very simply in your statement, and everyone will understand.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to follow up on that because like I was actually that undergrad that when I was applying to grad school, I had been in 4 different labs. And I agree that it was really important that I was able to craft a narrative around it. And so one of them was because I transitioned or transferred schools. Another one was because I just ended up not really liking the research part. It was because I worked with a really mean postdoc, but I did not mention that in the application, but I did mention how my interests changed. And so I kind of transitioned to this other lab. And then in the midst of that, also did this other summer research experience because it was like a good opportunity to gain skill with something like that, right? And so ultimately it is about crafting that narrative about how did you get to the interest you were. And I tried to sell as positive that like, look, I've gotten to explore all these different things. And as a result, I know for sure this is the type of science that I want to do, and was able to speak about that, like, and kind of like really be like, this is the thing that I want to do, right? And so having that narrative and like showing them that it's a plus that you've done it, not because like inherently like you've picked up so many different skills, because I think nobody really thinks that an undergraduate researcher or is going to be gaining that many skills when you're in the lab part-time, right? So for them, it's more about like, have you really thought about questions and kind of like come to some sort of maturity as far as thinking about scientific questions and like working through a problem, that kind of thing. And then in the end, like that last lab, I was there for a year. So, you know, I was there for like a longer period of time, which I think helped a lot too. And then I just wanted to mention real quick, because like I think our program does again, the neuroscience program does something a little bit different as far as reviewing a applicant's research experience. This maybe gets into the part about like the interview, but we actually do something which I had never seen before, but I think is actually a really good idea, where we one of the interviews for something like it's like a 30-minute time slot during which the applicant actually has it 2 or 3 slides and they present about some research that they've done. And then there's like 3 or 4 faculty members there as like a panel, and we just chat with them about the research that they've done and ask them some questions. And it's nice because it becomes a really focused time to talk to them about their research experience. And again, like Kent mentioned, like we definitely keep in mind the opportunities that those students had. Like, are they coming from a big name university? Have they been doing a post-bac research experience where they've been working full-time in a lab for like a year or two? Or are they like just doing this as an undergrad, like a PUI? And so, you know, we kind of like take that into mind as we're like evaluating what research they've done and how maturely they can speak about it during those presentations and as we're asking questions. But really for us, it's like just like, yeah, can they talk about their research? And like, rather than sneaking it into like a bunch of different one-on-one conversations with faculty, it becomes a dedicated time to really like chat with them about it. So, you know, it's a little bit scary and the students are all terrified of it, but or the applicants are all terrified of it, but I don't know, it's been, we try to reassure them that it's like a friendly situation, that we just want to chat with them about their science, and I've enjoyed that.
Awesome, thank you so much. So now this is a very wait, so cool. So now a question about recommendation letters. So when it comes to recommendation letters, how heavily are they weighted against other application components? Sorry. And what can an applicant do if their advisor submits a mediocre letter? And do applicants need recommendation letters from every single research experience that they do? Dr. Gordon, yeah.
So yeah, okay, I can try to be brief about it. Hope I don't leave out details. So but yes, I think I and the committee weigh them highly because they give you, you know, there's some research. You suppose that there's somebody with experience and has seen a couple undergraduates before and can speak to your motivation and trajectory. So that I feel it's not the best way of looking at an application, because sometimes I'm wondering if we are not then also, especially with the high number of applications that we get, score the talent of the letter writer of writing a good and memorable letter, right? You go through many of those letters in a very short time. So if something sticks out, that's really helpful. I do, so in that sense, I do read the letters when I can of people that know you well, and if it's just one letter, then that's just one letter. If it's a letter from a lecturer, that's usually just not so informative if they say that you were good at this and this class and you had a good project there, because it's a class project is not the same as a science project, because a science project, there's no right answer, so to speak. Right? With the class project, it's more of a it's confined in a way and doesn't show the skills that we are looking for. Yeah, so what can you do? So do applicants need, do you from every research experience? No, but I guess if you had like a 3-year research experience and then there's no letter there, that might raise a question and will probably come up in the interview if you get to be interviewed. So I hope I didn't oversimplify. Maybe the others could chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to address that last question because again, I switched labs a bunch before I applied to grad school and had this one experience that ended up being a really bad research experience because I did not get along well with the postdoc with whom I was working with at the time. And I remember agonizing quite a bit, like, do I include it on my CV? Do I mention it? And so I ended up taking because I knew I wasn't going to have a letter from that research experience because I didn't trust what might be in that letter, right? And so I luckily had enough other research experiences and like faculty that knew me quite well that I knew I'd get very good letters from. So one, I like didn't worry too much about getting those letters from that research experience. And then two, again, I addressed it head on in like that personal research statement type thing, mentioning that I had worked in this lab, but ended up not liking it. So switched to this other one. So kind of like, gave the reviewers looking at my application some like kind of tried to lead them towards like probably why I didn't have the letter was maybe like it just wasn't an enjoyable research experience, right? And kind of like tried to leave it at that. And that ended up being fine. So I'd say, yeah, you don't need to have letters from every research experience. Faculty will wonder if you've spent a significant amount of time with someone why you don't have a letter there. And you can either try to address that in some way in that research statement to kind of like provide some excuses so at least like they don't start to think the worst thing possible, and or you could potentially get your other letter writers to speak to it if it's significant or important enough. But again, I find that usually isn't necessary. So as long as you have some other letters that can kind of make up for it, I think it should be fine.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So very important question because I know a lot of students are working on a lot of applications at the same time. So it's important to watch out for cases of death of an application. So I want to get your insight on what you guys consider are cases of death. And also when an application is almost perfect, what do they tend to be missing and what do you guys like to hear more of in these applications?
I don't know if I'd say kisses of death from my side, but I don't think it's going to be secret stuff that you wouldn't guess. You know what I mean? If your application sounds threatening, if you're like complaining about how everything has been bad for you and therefore like there are right and wrong ways to write about these narratives we've been talking about. If your GPA isn't as high as you would have liked, or if you didn't have enough research experience, and the right way is not to I don't know, attack some other people or institutions or write something aggressive, because I mean this is stuff that's any job application of any type for any purpose. I mean you have to come across as professional. This is an environment where you're going to be working closely with other people for many years. So yeah, it's not so much as like something subtle that you might not think about that's going to come across. I think it's more the tone, and the so, but okay, something that might be maybe a bit more helpful than assuming that you're not going to do that is that you want to make it clear why you are going to grad school and why you are going to this program and why you are going to this institution. That would maybe be the subtle thing that would be kind of a kiss of death, if you will, and also the difference between like getting in or not is if everything else is fine and good research experience and whatever else the application is going to be reviewed on, if someone reading it doesn't know or isn't convinced that you actually have thought about going to grad school, that you want to be there, that this is aligned with your goals and interests and ambitions, then that is a big problem because as we keep iterating, it's a big commitment from both sides. And so you can't just say, here are my qualifications. You have to convince the committee that you want to be there.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree. Like the big thing is like you mention the wrong school or you don't really put any details about why that particular school. Then especially for us, like if we see a superstar applicant, but they don't talk at all about why Virginia Tech, we're going to be really worried that they don't actually want to come here, right? And then for us also as like a school in kind of a more rural area, like we want to make sure that you actually want to be here, and have thought about what it would be like to be here.
Thank you so much. So what steps are your respective universities taking to ensure equity and inclusivity are met throughout the entire application review process? If you guys have any insight on this.
I mean, briefly, I mentioned that, so we use a rubric, we account for differences in undergraduate institutions. We have spent a lot of time, going through these processes, like let's say a select committee, whose job it was to do this, spent a lot of time going through this so that, the bigger body of faculty wouldn't all have to, so that biases could be kind of addressed and prevented from entering into the process as much as possible, in a conscientious way, based on the kind of latest understanding of how these things come up in graduate admissions. So I think the holistic part is true and is implemented, but the rubric helps allow it to be more even across different faculty. And then the other thing that I know I heard one of the other panelists mention was, every application is seen by multiple faculty members. So it won't just be one person seeing your application. It'll be at least two and often more than that. And so there are, multiple opportunities for people to review it and debate over it and have different kinds of discussions. Not claiming it's perfect, but we do try to implement as much as we can.
Great. So the next question is about interviews, but in the interest of time, I will be skipping this. And something I'll say is that we will have a whole webinar about interviews and how to ace your interview. So we'll be announcing that very soon. So now let's go to our last question, which is very important, of course, because unfortunately a lot of applicants do not receive offer letters in the end. And I wanted you guys to provide any advice for students who do not receive these offer letters.
I would think that often it would help to have maybe a year of research experience or maybe even two. I wouldn't even see it as making your whole career trajectory longer because you get skills that make your PhD maybe shorter because you're maturing as a scientist. And then hopefully you get the skills to explain your research and have kind of a bit more big picture view and a good ladder to get you into a school that you like.
Yeah, I agree. And if you happen to get through the interview stage and there was any faculty members at like a particular school that you were hoping to get an offer letter from, with whom you felt like you got along very well. One thing is like, again, you could reach out to them to see if they're looking to hire like a research technician or know of anyone that would be hiring a research technician. And often that can be a way to kind of become embedded in like that environment and like learn more about like how you might better become a student there, kind of like work your way into the program that way. But I agree, like, it can be, it's obviously never fun to be rejected. But the great thing is that if you're able to secure a position as like a research technician somewhere doing full-time research, not only are you getting paid what you probably would have gotten paid as a graduate student anyway, but you're gaining a lot of experience that is just going to make you a much stronger applicant, and a much better graduate student, almost certainly. Like you're likely to be just much faster once you get to that grad school stage, and will progress through the whole process much faster too.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you
Oh, yeah.
can get in the school that you wanted to go as a tech already, you get good chances to find a way in.
And yeah, I want to say that I participated in a postbac program after my undergrad, and it was an amazing experience that prepared me a lot for grad school. And I know that Denisha can also say the same about these postbac programs. So, just a little bit of promo too, now that we're addressing this point, and the panelists have touched base on the importance and the benefit of gap years as well. So now I'm going to be stop sharing here, and I want to take some time to thank the panelists for their useful information. And I know there's like a lot more, like the admissions process is a very complex process, but we hope that with these highlights, we're able to provide very useful help for all of you. And I know that there's a lot of questions in the Q&A that we don't have time to get through, but please shoot us an email if you want to discuss a particular case, and we always know people that can help you with your specific case, and we can try to answer all your doubts and questions to our best ability. So once again, thanks to the panelists, and thank you all for your attention for attending this webinar.
Take care,
Sure.
everyone.
Thank you.